They dismiss me as too old, but I know my way around a kitchen. Sir, said the 50-year-old woman to the striking ranch owner, the morning carried spring's gentle exhale, sunlight angling across the weathered storefronts of the small frontier settlement as though it too wished to bless the tired timber with warmth. Dust lifted in lazy spirals where cartwheels had rolled, and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer rang against the hush of waking existence. Chickens darted through narrow passages. Children ran unshod in the cool earth, chasing a wheel that bounced and toppled. Amid the ordinary stir of the settlement, a woman walked with steps careful yet unwavering. Her wrap pulled close, though the air no longer carried winter's sting. Her name was Eleanor Hartwell, and the lines carved into her face told not of surrender, but of years endured. Gray threaded through her hair like silver frost, and her eyes, gentle yet steady, seemed to hold 100 forgotten dawns. She had lived 50 years on this unforgiving earth. She had buried a husband whose promises had faded long before his final breath. She had raised children who had scattered like birds from the nest, leaving her hands idle but not unwilling. Now she came to the settlement not to trade or gossip, but to ask for a place in a world that often closed its door against. Women passed their bloom. Her steps carried her to the general store, a squat building with its porch swept and its shelves crammed with flour sacks, nails, bolts of cloth, and all the lifelines of frontier existence. Inside stood Richard Malone, a man whose belly pressed against his waistcoat. Though he was only 42, whose eyes glinted with the smugness of one who thought prosperity made him wise. Eleanor, as she was still called by those who remembered her youth, stood before him and asked if he might take her on to keep the store tidy, or to cook for his family, or even to scrub the floors if nothing else. She did not beg, though her voice carried a soft humility that came not from weakness, but from years of being passed over. Richard looked at her with a smirk curling his lip. He let his eyes run over the strands of gray at her temple, the worn shoes on her feet, the wrap that had been mended too many times to count. "You're too old for work worth paying," he said, with a laugh loud enough for the 2 idlers at the counter to hear. "Too old for any man to keep around. There are young girls hungry for a position, girls with years in their hands. Why would I hire a grandmother to stir a pot?" The words fell heavy. The men chuckled. Eleanor's cheeks burned, yet she did not lower her gaze. She folded her hands calmly before her, thanked him for his time, and walked out with her back unbent. But inside her chest, a familiar ache pressed against her ribs, the ache of being seen only for the winters that had passed, and not for the strength that remained. On the porch of the boarding house across the street, a tall figure leaned against the post, hat tipped low. Connor Mitchell had come into town for feed and supplies, and though he rarely bothered with gossip, his ears caught the sound of Richard's cruel dismissal. Connor was a man of 37, with shoulders broad from years of ranch labor, his face marked more by silence than by words. His hair, dark and unruly, fell over eyes that had watched storms roll over plains and calves struggle into the world. He did not step forward then, only watched as Eleanor crossed the street with measured dignity, her wrap gathered like armor. Later that evening, Connor found himself once more near the boarding house. A lantern burned behind the thin curtain of the window where Eleanor sat, her hands kneading bread on a worn wooden table. Her voice, faint but resolute, carried through the open window as she spoke to the landlady who hovered beside her. "I may be too old, but I know my way around a kitchen, sir," she said, repeating the words Richard had mocked her with, though this time she spoke them as a vow rather than an apology. Connor stood in the shadows, watching the flour-dusted hands shape the dough, watching the quiet set of her shoulders. Something stirred within him, not pity, but recognition, as though he saw in her the same endurance that had carried him through drought and loss. He stepped forward at last and spoke with the simplicity that marked him. "If you'll cook for a week at my ranch, I'll pay fair," he said, his tone neither charity nor jest. "Men work better when fed proper. I'd be obliged." Eleanor looked up, startled by the presence of this tall rancher whose name she knew only from town talk. For a long moment, silence lay between them, broken only by the creak of the boarding house porch in the night wind. She searched his face for mockery and found none. She nodded once, slowly, her heart unsteady. The next morning, Eleanor rode with Connor to his ranch, a stretch of land where spring grass rippled like green waves and cattle dotted the hillsides. The Mitchell ranch house stood plain but strong, its porch lined with rocking chairs, one occupied by Iris Mitchell. Connor's aging mother, Iris's eyes, though dimmed with years, still held a keenness that made Eleanor's hands tremble as she descended from the wagon. Yet the old woman smiled faintly. As though she already knew the worth of the newcomer, Eleanor entered the kitchen, its shelves lined with chipped crockery and the lingering scent of beans boiled too long. She set to work with a quiet vigor that surprised even herself. By noon, the air filled with the fragrance of venison stew simmering, biscuits browning, coffee rich enough to lift weary spirits. The ranch hands drifted in with curiosity. Rough men hardened by labor, but softened by the aroma of real cooking. Samuel Hayes, the youngest among them, scoffed at first. "We don't need no grandmother fussing with pots," he muttered. Yet when the meal was laid and tasted, even his mouth bent into reluctant praise. Connor watched it all without much word. Though his eyes lingered on the ease with which Eleanor moved about the kitchen, her hands sure, her face alight with quiet purpose. For the first time in many months, laughter rose at the long table. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt her presence was not a burden, but a gift. Still, doubt whispered at the edge of her joy. When she fetched water from the pump at dusk, she overheard the ranch hands talking, some praising her, others suggesting that Connor had brought an old maid to mind the stove because no young woman would come near. The sting of those words cut deep, though she carried the bucket without a tremor. She had learned long ago to swallow the taste of shame. That night, she kneaded dough for the next day. Connor entered the kitchen. He said nothing at first, only leaned against the doorframe, watching the strong rhythm of her hands. The lantern cast soft light over the flour-dusted table, over the strands of gray that glimmered like threads of moonlight. "You've done more in a day than most could in a week," he said at last, his voice low and steady. Eleanor looked up, uncertain how to answer. Praise was a stranger to her ears. She tried to brush it aside, whispering that it was only bread and stew. But Connor shook his head. "It's more than that. Men eat, but they don't often feel cared for. You've given them both." The words settled in her chest, like embers glowing where once there had been only ash. She turned back to her work, but her hands trembled now not from weakness, but from the weight of being seen. When the last loaf was set aside, Connor lingered still, as though reluctant to leave the warmth of the kitchen. Outside, the night stretched wide, stars sharp against the dark sky. Inside, the air pulsed with something unspoken. Eleanor lowered her gaze, unsure if her heart dared believe in more than a day's shelter. Connor, tall in the doorway, let his eyes rest upon her longer than necessary, a quiet gaze that seemed to strip away the years others mocked, and leave only the woman she still was beneath them. And so the first day closed, not with grand declarations, but with silence heavy as a promise. For Eleanor, the world had always measured her by the winters behind her. But here, in the glow of a ranch kitchen, a man's eyes lingered as though spring had only just begun. Spring stretched her green arms wider with each passing day, and life on the Mitchell ranch seemed to lean into her embrace. The air softened, the soil warmed, and the cattle moved across the hills like slow shadows. In that season of beginnings, Eleanor Hartwell found herself woven into a rhythm she had not known in years. Morning began with the scrape of a match against flint, the kettle rising to a whistle, and the smell of coffee. She strung laundry along lines that ran from the porch to the barn, white shirts and work trousers lifting like sails against the blue sky. She bent over the chicken coop with a basket on her arm, lifting eggs still warm from their nests. She mended shirts by lantern light, her needle catching the fabric like fireflies caught on summer nights. Connor watched more than he spoke, noting the quiet competence she brought to every task, the way her presence seemed to steady not only the house, but the men who worked in its orbit. Iris Mitchell. Connor's mother grew fond of Eleanor's company. The older woman, frail and often confined to her chair by the hearth, studied Eleanor with eyes that still saw more than most. One afternoon, as Eleanor worked with flour on her hands, Iris said softly, "Child, you carry yourself with more vitality than most 20-year-olds. Don't let fools tell you otherwise." The words brushed Eleanor's heart like a blessing, though she smiled shyly and busied her hands as if the compliment might vanish if she met it head-on. She had grown accustomed to dismissals, not kindness. Still, kindness could not muffle the voices of the settlement. Word of her presence at the Mitchell Ranch spread with the same ease that rumors always did. When Connor walked beside her on their trips into town for flour or sugar, whispers rose like nettles along the boardwalks. Women pressed hands to their mouths, muttering about the old widow clinging to a younger man. Men chuckled that Connor Mitchell, handsome and strong, could do better than a cook with gray streaking her hair. Eleanor kept her head high, but each word cut at the skin of her dignity. It worsened the day Richard Malone caught them on Main Street. He stood in front of his store, with arms crossed over his barreled chest, a sneer pulling at his face. A fine rancher wasting his strength on a gray-haired cook, he drawled loud enough for half the town to hear. "You could have your pick, Mitchell, but you'd choose someone better fit for rocking chairs than dance floors." The laughter that followed burned hot against Eleanor's ears. She felt her knees weaken, but Connor's steady hand brushed against hers, grounding her. He said nothing to Richard, only guided her toward the wagon. His silence spoke more than any brawl could. Still, as they drove away, Eleanor's throat tightened with the shame of being the cause of mockery, aimed at the one man who had shown her respect that evening. She stood on the porch long after supper, the sky bruised with twilight and the air sweet with the scent of budding lilacs. Connor joined her, leaning on the railing beside her, the quiet stretching between them like a taut string. At last he spoke, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Don't let their words take root. They don't know you." Elena's eyes stung, though she kept them fixed on the horizon. "Maybe they're right," she whispered. "Maybe I've overstayed where I should never have stepped." Connor turned to her then, his gaze steady, unwavering. "You are not old, Eleanor. You are strong. You are seen." The words caught her breath. She had not been seen in years, not truly, not beyond the shell of age or the weight of loss. She nodded faintly, unable to answer, and slipped back inside. But his voice echoed in her chest long after the lamps were dimmed. The spring barn dance brought the tension to a sharper edge. Connor had mentioned it casually, saying the ranch hands looked forward to it, that music and laughter would do them all good. Eleanor helped prepare the food for the gathering, her hands busy while her mind whispered doubts. When evening came, lanterns strung between beams cast golden halos over the barn. Fiddles sang lively tunes, and boots struck the floor in a rhythm of joy. Eleanor lingered near the wall, watching as younger women twirled in bright dresses, their eyes turned toward Connor with shy hope. He danced once, twice, politely with girls whose laughter rose like bells. Eleanor's chest ached with a reminder of her place. She slipped toward the door, wrap gathered tight, tending to walk into the night before anyone noticed. But in the shadows by the doorway, Connor's hand touched her arm. She startled, her eyes lifting to his. He looked at her with the same quiet intensity he had shown the night she first baked bread in his kitchen. "I'd rather sit with." "You then dance with them?" he said simply. The words landed, like an arrow straight to her heart. For a moment, she searched his face for jest, for pity, for anything that might unravel the fragile thread of belief forming within her. But there was nothing there except truth, plain and unadorned. They sat together outside the barn, the night alive with music spilling into the open sky. Fireflies winked over the fields, and the scent of hay mingled with spring blossoms. Eleanor felt her hands tremble not from age, but from the closeness of a man who did not look past her, who did not dismiss her. Connor said little, but his silence was not empty. It was filled with presence, with an understanding deeper than words. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt the stirrings of something she had thought buried long ago, the fragile, but stubborn hope that she was not beyond love, that her story was not finished simply because her hair had turned silver. Yet as the night deepened and the sounds of laughter floated from the barn, she could not shake the fear that tomorrow the whispers would return, sharper than ever, and that Connor Mitchell, respected rancher, might one day tire of carrying her shadow. And so, while the dance played on, Eleanor sat with her heart torn between the warmth of being wanted and the chill of being judged. Connor's gaze rested on her still steady and unflinching, but her own eyes fell to her hands folded in her lap, as if afraid to meet the truth head-on. The lantern light flickered across their faces, and the music swelled behind them. For a moment it seemed as though time held its breath. Eleanor's doubts coiled inside her like a storm gathering. Even as Connor's nearness offered shelter, it was then she realized the battle was no longer against hunger or loneliness alone, but against the cruel measure of years and the voices that told her she was less than worthy. The night ended, but the question lingered in her chest, sharp and unresolved, whether she could ever believe what Connor saw when he looked at her, and whether she could bear the weight of the world's scorn for the chance to be truly loved. The days that followed the barn dance carried the hush of a storm waiting to break. Eleanor moved through her chores with quiet diligence, yet the echo of Connor's words, "I'd rather sit with you than dance with them," lingered in her chest like both balm and burden. Each glance he gave her, steady and unflinching, lit something within her she had thought long extinguished. And yet each whisper she heard in town, each mocking smile from neighbors, seemed to press upon her ribs until her breath came shallow. She rose early, baked bread until the air swelled rich with its scent, stitched seams until her eyes blurred, and still her heart whispered doubts. Was she worth the cost of Connor's reputation? Was her presence at his side a gift or a weight he would one day resent? When she looked in the mirror, face marked with age and lined with hardships, she could not imagine how he might see anything more. Connor, for his part, remained as he always was, steady, quiet, faithful to his work. He spoke sparingly, but in his silences she felt the thrum of something deeper. He would brush past her shoulder in the kitchen, linger at the table after the others had gone, or leave small gestures unnoticed by anyone else. A stool repaired before she had asked, a fresh bundle of herbs left on the counter for her stew, the firewood stacked neatly by the door. He saw her, and she knew it. Still, fear coiled inside her like a serpent that the seeing would one day fade. The town's cruelty sharpened with time. One afternoon, Eleanor walked with Iris to the general store. The old woman leaned heavy on her cane, her step slow, and Eleanor steadied her gently with one arm. The shop grew still as they entered. Women at the fabric counter lowered their voices, but not enough to spare Eleanor's ears. "Oh, gray hair in his kitchen. Gray hair in his bed soon enough," one whispered with a bitter laugh. "Mitchell could have any young girl in town," another said. "Instead, he wastes his name on a widow older than his own mother." Eleanor's cheeks burned, but Iris's grip tightened around her arm. The old woman lifted her chin, eyes sharp as they scanned the room. "Seems to me," she said, her voice cool as creek water, "the only gray in this room is the jealousy in your hearts." She turned back to Eleanor with a faint smile. "But you're a fool, Mitchell," Richard sneered. "Every man in town laughs behind your back. You could have had a wife to give you sons, a woman fit for your name. Instead, you chain yourself to an old maid. She'll drag you down, and the world will know you were too blind to see it." Connor's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the fence until his knuckles whitened. For a heartbeat, Eleanor feared he might strike the man. But Connor's voice came low and steady, like thunder far off. "Words aren't worth blood, Richard, but hearts are worth everything, and hers is worth more than all your pride." Richard spat on the ground, muttered a curse, and walked off, leaving dust in his wake. Eleanor stood frozen, her breath shivering. She wanted to run, to hide, to keep Connor from paying the cost of defending her. Yet she also wanted to weep with a strange, fierce pride. His words had set a light in her chest. That evening she went about her work in silence, her mind storming. Connor ate quietly at the table, his eyes lingering on her face. When the others had gone, she turned to him with trembling hands. "Why do you keep me here? Why stand against them when they're not wrong?" "I am old, Connor. I cannot give you what they say you deserve." Connor looked at her then, long and deep, until she had to drop her gaze. His words came slow, carved from truth. "I see years. I see a woman who works with her whole heart. They see gray. I see silver made of fire. They see what's past. I see what's here. Eleanor's throat closed. She wanted to believe him, yet fear pressed hard. She turned back to her kneading, flour streaking her hands. Tears hot against her cheeks. The storm broke that night, not with words, but with fire. A lantern left too near the hay in the lower barn caught the dry straw, and flames leapt suddenly into the spring sky. Shouts rang out, boots pounded the earth. Men scrambled to drive horses free. Connor called orders, his voice cutting through the chaos. Eleanor ran without thought. Smoke burned her eyes, but she saw Iris's frail figure stumbling near the barn door. Coughing without pause, Eleanor plunged into the haze, wrapped her wrap around the old woman's shoulders, and pulled her clear of the smoke. Her lungs seared, her skin blistered from the heat. But she held firm, guiding Iris to safety, even as sparks rained down. When Connor turned and saw them emerge from the haze, Iris leaning on Eleanor's arm, Eleanor's face blackened with soot, but her eyes fierce and unyielding. Something shifted inside him like a door opening to light. The fire roared behind them, but he saw only her, framed by flame, strong and alive. Later, when the fire was beaten down and the night lay heavy with smoke, the ranch hands murmured of her courage. Even Samuel Hayes shook his head in awe. But Eleanor, sitting on the porch with her wrap charred and her hands raw, felt only weariness. She stared at the blackened ruin of the barn and whispered to herself, "What place do I have here if I bring only trouble?" Connor knelt beside her, his hand brushing her arm. She looked at him, eyes wet, heart trembling with shame and pride in equal measure. And in his gaze she saw no hesitation, no doubt. She saw a man who had witnessed her fire, not her years. Yet even then, fear clung to her. She turned her face away, unable to trust that the world would not snatch this fragile hope from her hands. And so the storm left. Behind silent smoke curling into the night, men whispering of her bravery, Connor's steady presence beside her. But within Eleanor, the battle raged on. Could she ever believe what he saw? Or would she always be chained by what others whispered? The night closed with the ranch hushed, the embers still glowing in the distance. Eleanor lay in her bed, her body aching from smoke and strain. In the darkness, she replayed Connor's words, "They see gray. I see silver made of fire." And as her eyes closed, her heart shuddered with both terror and wonder-terror that she might one day lose the shelter of his gaze. Wonder that perhaps she never had to. The dawn, after the fire broke, soft and golden, as if the earth wished to cleanse itself of smoke and fear. The Mitchell ranch lay quiet, save for the calls of mourning doves and the lowing of cattle unsettled by the night's terror. Ash hung in the air, still drifting in pale flecks that settled on fence rails and porch steps. Eleanor rose early despite her raw throat and blistered hands. She pulled her wrap close around her shoulders, though it still carried the scent of char and ruin, and went about boiling water. Setting the kettle to hum, her body ached, her lungs burned. But something deeper than exhaustion pressed against her ribs, the heavy knowledge that she had stood at Connor's side in fire, yet still feared she did not belong there. When the ranch hands filed in for breakfast, their gazes lingered longer than usual. Samuel Hayes, who rarely softened his tongue, nodded once in her direction and muttered, "Would have lost the old barn. And maybe more if you hadn't run in." Others agreed in low murmurs, though Eleanor only bowed her head and ladled stew into bowls. Praise made her chest tighten, for it always seemed borrowed, never hers to keep. Connor came in last, his hair damp from the trough where he had washed the soot from his face. He met her eyes briefly, and the weight of that look nearly stopped her breath. It carried no pity, no hesitation, only a quiet steadiness, as though the fire had burned away every shadow that once stood between them. He ate little, spoke less. But when the men rose to their work, he lingered behind, his hands clasped on the table. "You risked your life," he said at last. Voice low but ringing with something unshakable, Eleanor shook her head quickly. Iris needed help. Any woman would have. "No," he interrupted, his tone firm. Not any you. She turned away, busying herself with wiping a clean pot, though her hands trembled. The air between them thickened with words unspoken, with the ache of two hearts circling the truth, yet afraid to step into its center. That afternoon, Is beckoned Eleanor to her chair by the window. Sunlight streamed across the old woman's lap, painting her frail hands in gold. "You saved me," Iris whispered. "But more than that, you've given my son something he's long needed. He walks lighter since you came." Eleanor's throat ached with tears she dared not let fall. "I am only a cook," she said softly. "You are more," Iris replied, eyes fierce despite the wear of years. "Don't let your fear make you blind." But fear was a stubborn shadow, and Eleanor could not shake the whispers of the town. Days later, when she walked again through Main Street, the laughter of women at the well cut through her like thorns. They spoke of the fire of Connor's loyalty, and of the shame that a man such as he should bind himself to a woman with silver in her hair. Eleanor lowered her gaze, cheeks hot, and hurried back to the ranch, shame clinging to her wrap like smoke. That evening, she found Connor mending a fence post by lantern light. His shirt clung to him with sweat, his muscles straining as he drove the hammer. She watched him for a moment, the flicker of flame painting him in hues of bronze. A younger woman would stand boldly at his side, she thought. A younger woman would not weigh him down with gossip and cruel laughter. She turned to retreat, but his voice cut through the dark. "Eleanor." He set the hammer aside and came toward her, the lantern's swinging shadows across his face. "I've heard what they say. I don't care, do you?" Her lips parted, but no words came. The question lodged in her throat, heavy and cruel. She wanted to cry yes. She cared because their scorn carved her flesh each time she stepped into town. But she also wanted to say no, to rise above it, to believe that love could silence every mocking voice. Instead, she whispered, "I cannot bear you paying such a price for me." Connor stepped closer until the lantern light caught the storm in her eyes. "You are not a price," he said, voice rough with conviction. "You are the worth itself." Her breath broke, and she fled into the house, her heart pounding like a horse against its stall. "Eleanor Hartwell," he said, loud enough for all to hear, "you are not too old. You are not cast aside. You are the one my home has been waiting for." Her hands trembled, her heart breaking open beneath the weight of his vow. She shook her head, tears streaming. "I am not worthy," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the stunned quiet. But Connor stepped to her side, took her hand in his, and pressed his lips to her knuckles before the whole town. "You are worthy. You always have been." A murmur rippled through the crowd, shifting from laughter to awe. Iris, watching from her chair, lifted her chin in pride. The ranch hands stood straighter, their eyes bright with loyalty. Even Samuel, awkward and young, muttered under his breath. Never seen courage like that from either of them. Eleanor wept openly now, the years of scorn and shame melting in the heat of Connor's truth. She tried once more to pull away, but he held fast, his hands steady as the land itself, and in that grip she felt the ground of her life shift not downward into loss, but upward into a love that defied every cruel measure of years. The days that followed were filled with a new kind of light. The townsfolk, shamed into silence, could no longer mock openly. At the ranch, laughter flowed more freely, work hummed with ease. And Eleanor moved not as a shadow but as a woman finally seen. When spring blossoms opened across the orchard, Connor asked her to be his wife. He did not kneel with flourish or ring, but stood before her in the quiet of the porch, his eyes steady, his words simple. "I want you beside me, Eleanor." For all the years still to come, her tears fell into her hands, her voice breaking. "I thought love had passed me by. It only waited," he answered. Their wedding came beneath the blooming trees, with Iris weeping softly, ranch hands cheering, and even Samuel placing wildflowers in Eleanor's hair with a grin. She wore a plain dress, her wrap mended one final time, and when Connor took her hand, the years between them melted into nothing but light. That night, as dusk settled and lanterns flickered, Eleanor stood on the porch of the Mitchell Rancher home at last. Connor stood beside her, his hand warm in hers, his gaze steady as it had always been. She thought of all the whispers, all the laughter, all the years she had carried the weight of being too old. And now she felt them fall away like ash on the wind, in a land that worshipped youth and strength. Love bloomed in the quiet places where two souls found each other, not in the first spring of life, but in the season when roots run deepest. And perhaps that is the truth worth remembering. You are not too old, not too late, not beyond love's reach. Love waits in places you least expect, and it finds you when you are ready to believe again.